President of the European Council, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. In a few hours' time, we will be in Brussels for the EU-Africa Summit. But yesterday, in Paris, all the African, European, and Canadian partners were present, all those who are fighting terrorism in the Sahel. Before that, for several months, we have had discussions, and these have been political and also on a basis of cooperation. And we have come to some statements which are in the final communiqué, which will be published in a few minutes. But I would just like to say a few words now. As Africa is under increased threat of terrorism and other forces, we thought it was very important for all of us to make a statement here to say that we stand firm against terrorism in Africa. Europe is a staunch partner of Africa and will be present over the long term, and with the ECOWAS, the African Union, and the Sahel countries, it will stand as a strong partner. Al-Qaeda and Daesh, ISIS, therefore, are the organizations that are using Africa, particularly the Sahel and the Gulf of Guinea, as their forefronts for development of further activities. They use local causes and use these to push their regional and local agendas further. All those who have been present there have come across these activities, and we all know that if we want to fight back, you have to be constant and tenacious. Since 2013, and since the very strong decision taken by President François Hollande to intervene in Mali, and this was following a request made by the Malian authorities and people in the region, France has played an important role in federating together, bringing together all the partners in the Sahel. 25,000 men have been active in the field. In Po and in N'Djamena, we took further positions that strengthened this position that we had in Sahel. And we set up a coalition for Sahel. We will continue to persevere, and this is what I said yesterday, to be the country that brings together, to federate all the activities and be the one that would be a sort of framework country for the others. We also feel, based on the discussions, that a real consensus agrees to continue in 4 directions. First of all, to use neighbouring countries, particularly those in the Gulf of Guinea, more increasingly. As the attacks in the north of Benin showed us a few days ago, that these countries are increasingly under the threat of terrorist action in their countries. The G5 Sahel Forum is, of course, the key forum for actually moving forward. But the Accra Initiative with Burkina Faso, Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire should also be a reference structure. Not really to be yet another regional structure, but to enable each of the countries to take steps to receive the bilateral aid that they need and to take the right action. Terrorists, of course, make the most of the fact that borders are open and porous. And this is why it's important to reinforce coordination between the region, between the countries of the region. And this is why we think the Accra Initiative and the G5 Sahel and the ECOWAS together will be able to go much further. And all the countries that I mentioned, including Senegal, are fighting terrorism in this manner. The second direction that we want to move in, and that we all agreed on, is to also include civil society much more in our fights against terrorism. The population of the Sahel are the main targets for Al-Qaeda and Daesh. But we cannot just consider them to be victims. They are the rampart, the first rampart against these groups. And we feel that it's more important for us to stand by their side and not only deal with these issues from a security point of view, which is a narrow point of view. The G5 Sahel aim is to support local populations, but also to hear what they have to say. 25 partners are involved, including the United States soon. $22 billion have been committed and promised, and we hope that this alliance will be able to help us to change paradigms. It'll be used to first set up civil programs, and these will be able to therefore reinforce the strategies of national authorities. This will just add to the other action that we are taking, and then it is only with this in hand that military action can have some impact. The third direction, third agreement, is that we have agreed that we also have to work on our military presence and the way in which it is going to be worn out in those areas. Things have changed in the area, and we have to draw conclusions from the recent changes. And after the Po summit, which was in 2020, and the N'Djamena summit, which was recent, we should take the same sort of steps. In the Kidal, Tisali, and Timbuktu were three of our sites that we're going to close. But then the next step is, following requests or demands made by our partners, we will take action, as we are doing in Niger, with the local forces. In the weeks and months ahead, we will define the sort of support we can give to each of the countries in the region based on their demands and their needs. It will need training, for example, supplies of equipment, or also support in specific actions against terrorism. And the fourth direction, or fourth area that we've agreed on, is that we all recognize that we cannot take military action with different authorities who are there and have been there for a long time, but with whom we cannot actually agree or see eye to eye from a political point of view. That is our position right now in Mali. Obviously, fighting terrorism is indispensable, but we cannot use it to replace the acknowledgement of governments or powers that may not necessarily have the same principles or rules or conventions as us. And therefore, France and its partners who are fighting terrorism, all the participating countries in the Takuba force, have decided to withdraw from Mali. This withdrawal means that the Kossi, Menaka, and Gao sites will be closed. It will be done in an orderly way with the help of the Malian authorities and the UN representatives in Mali. During that period, we will continue to work with the UN mission in Mali. We will also work closely with local and neighbouring countries, with the Nigerian authorities. We will be with the authorities of Niger right at the border with Mali. And finally, we will also work with the local population in Mali through different programs to make sure that these programs really are used for what they are designed for and not used by mercenaries or others. It is in this way that we will be able to step up a collective step action, which we have already explained in Po and N'Djamena. We have had good results since 2013. France and its partners have caused major defeats to Al-Qaeda and Daesh and have halted the activities of these two organizations. We received this in these achievements by sharing arms. And this has been done 50 years after the freedom liberation of Mali. We have not forgotten any of these episodes. We have not forgotten any of the 53 soldiers who have fallen, any of the wounded or their families who have sacrificed themselves for this cause and for the two countries. And this morning, as I speak, I am thinking solemnly for all those who have fallen in the Sahel, standing for freedom and for the principles that we uphold. And also the 6 French who lost their lives in Niger and who had come to Niger to work with an organization. I think it would have been a mistake to remain static, and it would have been probably in vain taking action against terrorist organizations or others without this form of coordination. This is why we have taken these decisions, which will allow us to continue to provide partnership upstream, training upstream, and this partnership will be respectful of each other, it will be balanced, and we hope that it will also spread to other areas. And we will discuss this at the EU-Africa Summit, which is going to open in a few minutes. Let me give the floor now to Mr. Macky Sall. Thank you very much. Thank you, dear Emmanuel. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your kind invitation and for the very warm welcome. I'd also like to recognize the President Nana Akufo-Addo, who is the President of Ghana and who is the President of ECOWAS, and also the presence of our friend Charles Michel, who is the President of the European Council. As the acting President of the African Union, I came to Paris yesterday, thanks to an invitation extended by President Macron, and had discussions with European and African colleagues and the president of different of the ECOWAS and others to have consultations before the EU-Africa Summit opens in Brussels. But in fact, these discussions go back to the G20 in Rome, then at the Dakar Peace Forum, and also last month in Brussels. So yesterday was a continuation, and it was probably just the last meeting where we were fine-tuning our positions. Last night, as President Macron said, we had discussions on the issues concerning security and fighting terrorism. And these are, of course, vital, essential issues for our two continents. And this is also important because there's only 15 kilometers between Africa and Europe. Anything that affects one will obviously affect the other, and vice versa. Fighting terrorism, therefore, for the past decade, has become a major challenge for African countries. And we do not wish our continent to become the foyer for all terrorism in the world. This is why we are working with our European partners, and we have undertaken this for a long time. Particularly, we have welcomed the presence of France in Mali. As we said, this was since 2013, following requests made by the Malian authorities with different missions, Barkhane, Serval, and others. And yesterday, with our colleagues and partners, we came to the conclusion that given the present circumstances in Mali, we understand the decision taken by France and the European partners to no longer be present in Mali. There have been two coups d'etat. There have been difficulties between the Malian governments and the European representatives. We have taken note of this, but we also realize that fighting terrorism in Sahel is not something that Africans can handle alone. And this is a consensus that we achieved. And the commitment was made once again that the our European partners will continue to be present and that this will maybe take different forms. And we hope that discussions between ECOWAS and Mali will allow us to come back to new ways of bringing back a certain balance to the country. I would also like to say, as far as ECOWAS is concerned, it has strictly respected and applied the rules and regulations. And when it became apparent that it was impossible to achieve a consensus on a date for the elections, the additional act on good governance and democracy was applied. But we will continue to have discussions, and next Monday we will once again be having a meeting between ECOWAS, the African Union, and the Malian authorities, and we will then see where we stand and also see what the position of Mali will be. I would also like to say that we have fully recognized the efforts made by France and the huge sacrifices. This is why we too stand strong and respectfully in front of the fallen in Mali. And we are grateful to Europe and to France for committing to pursuing its efforts, their efforts in Sahel and in Africa. If this support were not there, I think it would be more complicated and more difficult for us to work towards restoring balance and normalcy in our countries. So thank you very much for reiterating this commitment. Thank you very much. Now, let me give the floor to the President of Ghana, who is the President of ECOWAS.
President Macron, once again, thank you for the invitation last night to come here to meet with you and other colleagues to look at the situation, the evolving situation in the Sahel and within the ECOWAS region, and then for today's engagement with the press. I think there are two or three basic things that unites all of us. One is the critical role that France has played in the struggle against terrorism in the Sahel and in West Africa. And it has entailed considerable human and financial sacrifices on the part of France. But it has been welcomed because we are looking at the struggle against terrorism in West Africa as a common fight. It isn't just a fight for us in West Africa. It's an international situation, and we have to look at it in the context of a broad response, like we've seen elsewhere in the world in the fight against terrorism. West Africa is no different. But clearly, the political circumstances in Mali today have made it necessary for the French and European partners to rethink the nature of their involvement and assistance in the fight against terrorism. The epicenter is Mali, in Mali and the neighboring regions. We support this reformulation and the rethinking, but the decision essentially is that of the French and the European partners. They are finding it difficult to be able to cooperate in any meaningful way with the authorities in Mali over the joint thing. All of West Africa, and this is the interest of ECOWAS, all of West Africa, including the coastal states, I refer here to Côte d'Ivoire, to Ghana, Togo, Benin, all the states in West Africa. We already know about the threats of terrorism in Nigeria with Boko Haram, but all of the states in West Africa are vulnerable to the penetration of terrorist outrages in West Africa. And we are therefore re-examining, together with our friends and partners, the manner in which we can respond most effectively to these emerging threats. That there is a need for a broad coalition of forces against terrorism in West Africa is indisputable. Well, our belief is that at the center of any successful initiative must be the primacy of the armed forces of the countries of the region. What the French and other European nations can bring by way of assistance has to be assistance to our forces who are engaged in the fight against terrorism. And that is the whole purpose of the Accra Initiative that we originated in Ghana, to bring together the coastal states to anticipate the problems that are now before us, and do so by sharing intelligence, cooperating in joint border raids against terrorist cells in our areas and beyond. And now looking at, again, at the possibility of what other options are available to us in the Accra Initiative and within the broader ECOWAS community as to how to confront this menace. It cannot be that, having been chased out of the Middle East and Afghanistan, that the terrorist elements will find permanent home in West Africa. That cannot be the case. We have also to be resolute in making sure that the future of our nations are free of these terrorist and violent extremists. There is a fundamental determination of all of us within the ECOWAS community, and that is to construct a future based on democratic values. That is a fundamental principle that animates the protocols that link all of us in West Africa, a commitment to democratic values, to democratic legitimacy. And this is what has compelled us to take action in all the states which have now suffered unconstitutional changes of government, in Guinea, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, that we do not accept that in West Africa, within the ECOWAS space, changes of government will come through the barrel of the gun. The changes of government that will come that are legitimate and acceptable are those that are ordained by the people through free and transparent elections, through the ballot box. And that fundamental commitment is what shapes all of us, all of ECOWAS's policies within the community and in the response. But as we're here, basically, is to affirm the conditions that have led to a reformulation of France's position in West Africa, and to say that we continue to value the support of France in the struggle against terrorism in our area.
Merci, Président.
Thank you.
La parole est au président du Conseil européen, M. Charles Michel.
And now,
Merci beaucoup,
Mr. Charles Michel, President of the EU Council. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the meeting that was held yesterday was very important because it brought together, on the French President's initiative, many African representatives, but also representatives of European countries that are mobilized in the Sahel region. It was also an opportunity to clearly reaffirm without any ambiguity the sincere and loyal commitment, the sustainable commitment of the EU side by side with our African partners. It was an opportunity for us to create greater synchronization with our African partners. This is very coherent, a joint decision that we have made because we are determined to face the terrorist threat together. And I would like to join those of you who have paid homage to soldiers and civilians, both French and African, who have fallen to terrorist barbarians. As the situation changes, we must act differently as well. We have to give a greater impetus, and this was the case yesterday, greater impetus to actions that have been decided on together. We have to re-articulate the mechanisms for action. It was a very useful meeting yesterday to talk in very real terms about how we might, in the next weeks and months, pull our actions together so that we can undertake the useful and necessary steps to push back the terrorist threats and to bring stability and safety to the region. Several of you have said that we have to take into account, of course, the Sahel region, but also the Accra Initiative, which was an opportunity where we were able to show our commitment and our tenacity, our desire to mobilize other countries in this Accra Initiative. And we have been able to we'll be opening the first Africa-EU summit since Abidjan with a very high level of participation, which I think illustrates how important this is both for Africa and the EU, that we have a shared ambition for a renewed partnership facing the future, a sincere, loyal partnership with new principles of mutual respect, shared interests, and the conviction that together we can meet two objectives, that is, to bring out progress for peace, development, prosperity. Africa is facing many challenges today in this generation, and it is our responsibility to ensure that the prosperity and stability and security come to the region. And we know just how important this is for Africa. It is good for Africa, and it is good for Europe. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you all. And now we will take any questions. Jérôme Rivet from the AFP. Mr. President, when you look at the 9 years of commitment in Mali, would you say that it has been a failure? Some politologues have said that it has been a failure. And would you say that withdrawing from Mali could encourage a return of jihadists in the northern part of the country? Thank you very much. I refuse that word of failure for several reasons. First of all, what would have happened in 2013 if France had not intervened? I think certainly you would have seen the Malian state would have crumbled. That was what was about to happen. Perhaps at best it would have been a caliphate, and at worst it would have been a terrorist state. And in particular, Al-Qaeda in the region had the capacity to travel down as far south as Bamako, and that was the situation at the time in 2013. So don't forget where we started from. What would have happened if we hadn't intervened? I say this very clearly. What was happening at the time, and French intervention avoided the catastrophe. That was potentially being prepared. In February 2018, the Emir disappeared. In 2020, another Emir and other lieutenants disappeared or died, and this meant that the situation of the terrorist groups, whether we're looking at the northern part of Mali or the border zones, it's quite different now than it was 8 years ago, because the Barkhane and the Serval missions and all of our partners worked hard to eliminate the terrorist threat. And with the EUTM mission and the EU and the G5 Sahel have worked together to consolidate the different African armies in the region. And so the situation of these armies is today quite different than it was 9 years ago. So this leads me to say that I don't think that our intervention can be qualified as a failure. France intervened in Mali, first of all, to fight against terrorism, second, at the request of a sovereign state and other states in the region. And this was the second condition that has changed today. The victory against terrorism can only be won if the states themselves participate in the struggle. The junta that is now in charge of Mali is no longer setting the fight against terrorism as a priority. They have adopted different strategies. Unfortunately, states that are not fighting against terrorism or that are a bit ambiguous about it for different reasons, whether we're looking at Mali or Burkina Faso, the situation has gotten out of control. On the other hand, if you look at Mauritania or Niger, you can see that the work that we have done there, the intervention of supporting forces, training of the military forces, building up a national army, developing economic projects to shore up the state. All of this has resulted in greater stability. Look at Mauritania, for example. The situation has changed radically since 2013. So I think that the intervention of a foreign army cannot be used as a substitute for a national army, but it can support a national army and help them to avoid the worst-case scenario, which is what happened. But we are not seeking to substitute our forces for the forces of the region. That's never been our objective. And in particular, we respect territorial sovereignty throughout Africa. We have journalists in Brussels. Bakary Traoré, who is a fact-checker from Côte d'Ivoire.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Hello, Mr. President.
Merci beaucoup pour cette opportunité.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Moi, je pose une question
I would like to ask a question
dans le
to
contexte
the
actuel,
President of the
on voit
French
que
Republic. In the
la
context
France
today, where we see
fait
that
vraiment d'une certaine hostilité, on le voit sur les
there
réseaux
has been
sociaux.
some hostility
Est-ce
against
que,
France, we
pour
see
les
it in
Européens,
particular
c'est
on
le bon timing
social
pour que la France
media,
soit à la tête du Conseil européen?
and
Et
this is
deuxième
also
question
coming at a time when
rapidement,
France is at the
toujours sur la
head of
France.
the EU
Est-ce que comment la
Council.
France compte utiliser la facilité européenne
So I'd like to say,
pour la
how
paix dans sa stratégie
do you plan
militaire
to
au Sahel
use
aussi,
EU
dans
support
toute la zone,
in
dans toute la
your
région?
military strategy
Merci.
in the Sahel and throughout the region?
La deuxième question, c'est aussi le président
So
Charles Michel revenir s'il le
I
souhaite.
think Charles Michel could
vais
also
être
help
très
answer
clair
this
avec
question. But I'd like to be very clear.
Il y a une présidence rotative, elle arrive
The
maintenant.
European presidency
C'est un fait et nous prenons nos
rotates.
responsabilités.
Today it is
Deuxième élément, la
France's
France
turn.
joue le rôle de nation cadre, mais notre souhait est de
France
travailler
is
avec
a
l'ensemble des
framework
Européens
country,
et
but we work
l'ensemble des
with
pays africains de la
all
région. C'est d'ailleurs
European countries and all
le
African
cadre
countries
même de
as
la
well.
discussion que nous avons eue hier et notre
The context
manière
of
d'avancer.
yesterday's
C'est
discussion
exactement
is how we
l'esprit de
plan
Takuba.
to
Et ce
work
que nous avons
together.
fait
It
ces
is the
derniers
same
mois,
in the same spirit
travailler
that
en
we had the
soutien, en
Takuba
appui avec
agreements.
les armées africaines concernées
We work
et en
with
lien étroit avec tous les Européens
African
qui sont
armies,
prêts à travailler avec
and we
nous.
work closely
Et
with
c'est aussi
any
pour cela
European
que
states that wish
nous
to join
mobilisons
in this
des
effort.
instruments, des
So we
financements européens
mobilize
en fonction des missions,
mechanisms,
mais sur une base
instruments,
simple, c'est l'expression des besoins des
financing,
États africains concernés.
but only based on
Enfin,
the needs as they are
Comme vous,
expressed
je
by the
constate
African
qu'il y a
states
sur les réseaux
themselves.
sociaux, parfois dans la rue, mais
With regard to
vous êtes journaliste.
social
Et donc,
media and
votre rôle n'est pas simplement de suivre je
perhaps
crois, ce qui se dit, mais
mistrust
d'essayer
or
de
dislike
comprendre
of France,
qui
I
parle
think
et d'où.
it's important to
Je
understand
constate
who
que
is
beaucoup de gens qui expriment
speaking
sur les
out
réseaux
against
sociaux
France. A lot
des
of
messages
people on the
anti-français
social
sont des gens qui
media
sont
who are
financés.
speaking out
Ce sont
against
des
the French are
activistes qui sont
people that are,
financés
in fact, they're
par la
activists who
Russie
are
et par
financed
d'autres
by
puissances qui
Russia
ont installé en
and
effet
other powers
ce discours, ce langage. On en a parlé
who
d'ailleurs très
have
franchement hier.
set up
Et
this
ce
whole
discours d'ailleurs vient
language,
parfois
this
frapper
whole
des dirigeants. Plusieurs ici ont
anti-French
pu le vivre
campaign.
en Afrique. Et donc nous avons besoin aussi de
So,
nous armer car
we
l'information, les réseaux sociaux
need
sont devenus des lieux de
our armies
mobilisation
because you
pour
can
parfois
see that social media
pousser les
sometimes
gens à la
mobilize
grande
people
violence,
to
les
push them
désinformer
towards violence
et en faire
through
des
disinformation
instruments de
and
guerre ou
actually
d'opposition politique.
makes them an instrument
Et je pense que ce
of
qui est très important, c'est
war,
de bâtir un
conflict,
cadre d'information neutre, libre, partout dans nos
or
démocraties.
political
Et de
manipulation.
savoir quand
So
on
we
évoque
have
les
to
phénomènes
work
que vous
together
évoquez, d'où ils
to
viennent,
build our democracies.
qui
When
parle et au nom
I
de
would
qui.
say if you're looking at anti-French
très clairement,
sentiment, I'd like to see
je crois que
who is expressing
les
it
Africaines et les
and who
Africains
is paying them to
savent,
express it.
comme
I think
d'ailleurs avec tous les
most
pays, les
Africans
qualités,
know,
les
as
défauts, il y a des gens qu'on aime,
everyone
qu'on
does.
préfère,
You know, there are
d'autres pas,
certain
mais enfin,
countries that you like more than
à chaque
others.
fois que je
Everyone
suis
has
allé au
their
Mali ou dans la région, j'ai
qualities
vu des
and
femmes et
their
des hommes qui mesuraient
and their faults.
l'engagement de nos soldats,
But I
ce que
think
ça
that
représentait
many
pour
people in
les
Africa
familles de ces
are
derniers,
well
les
able
sacrifices
to
faits.
measure
J'ai vu
the
aussi parfois des
sacrifices that
activistes
France has made
bien
and the
payés
commitments that we have
dire le
made.
pire des
I have
contre-vérités
seen
massives. Donc je
many
pense que notre rôle
activists who
est de
have
dénoncer comme dirigeants et
put out
pour vous de rétablir la
disinformation
vérité
on
comme
a
journaliste.
massive scale. And I think it's very important for journalists to investigate that.
Affirmer que l'Union européenne et les États
I would
membres
like
sont
to affirm
parfaitement
that the
engagés,
EU
parfaitement
is
unis,
clearly
parfaitement
engaged in a
rassemblés.
united
Effectivement,
front.
nous travaillons aussi pour
We
améliorer
are
notre
working to
capacité de mieux rencontrer
improve
les
our
besoins
capacity
en termes de
to better
coopération
evaluate the
au sein de la
needs
sécurité et de la stabilité.
for
C'est le sens de
cooperation
cette facilité paix.
with regard
Et
to
comme je l'ai dit
security
tout à
and
l'heure, nous avons eu l'occasion
prosperity
hier
for the
soir,
regions of Africa.
d'évoquer avec les
And
partenaires africains
yesterday
de
we
manière
talked
plus
about this
précise,
with the
quels sont les besoins
African
précis
representatives
que nous allons
to
être à
define
même
what
de
are
rencontrer,
the
Union
specific
européenne plus
needs
les États
that
membres.
the
Et d'ailleurs,
EU
hier,
and the member states can respond to in a significant manner. And we can see clearly that there is a clear commitment on the part of many EU member states. We are on the same page in terms of our policies, and we're ready to be mobilized under a very significant French leadership during this French presidency of the EU to strengthen this relationship between the EU and Africa. Patrick Sauce from BFM TV. Mr. President, after we've seen what has happened in the past, let's look at the very short-term perspective. You came out with a statement where you said that by next June, we would have to have an outlook. You talked about a balanced and a respectful partnership, as President Macron said, but I haven't heard you talk about Barkhane specifically. What is going to happen in the next weeks with 2,400 French soldiers who will be working on a logistic problem? Will they be leaving Mali? There are 800 or 900 mercenaries from a country that we are in conflict with today. And what is going to happen between now and June in this regard? I think we're talking about redeployment of troops. I think the French army will have to make the specific decisions. As I said, we will start shutting down bases in the north progressively, and this will take 4 to 6 months. And these are the different bases in Mali. And during this time, we will be deploying logistics and security forces to ensure peaceful withdrawal, and we will be assuring the security of the UN forces as well. There will be changes, EUTM, and the UN forces as well. In this context, this work of redeployment will be carried out with the army of Mali. We know them well because we have trained them and financed them. But you're right to say that in this context, there will be less fight against terrorism. Because of the choices of the Malian junta, there is less terrorism. They have not been working very hard against terrorism. We have not yet qualified the type of cooperation we will have with them or that they will have with other states. Of course, clearly, if Mali wants to work with Russia with regard to armed forces, they can do so. They have done so, in fact, since their independence. But we're not looking at relationships between sovereign states. We're looking at the fact that the Malian government has employed mercenaries that they have brought in to shore up the junta and the economic interests of the junta. This is the responsibility of the Malian government. It is not the responsibility of the French army to intervene in that regard. With the Nigerian authorities and throughout the region, we will be organizing this pull-out from Mali. We'll be working with our special forces in Burkina Faso, and we will be working with forces that are already present in Niger with Nigerian forces. We will be developing forces that will be both African and European. In N'Djamena, we decided that Barkhane was there to back up Takuba. We decided to close the northern bases, and we were Europeanizing our presence with a mechanism that is no longer a mechanism of large fixed bases, but support to the armed forces in the region and to focus on terrorist targets in the region in a very specific manner. So this mechanism and the spirit of this mechanism remains, and that's why we'll be discussing with our African partners in the next weeks and months. We need to see the needs of the different members of the G5 Sahel,
le soutien des
ECOWAS,
Européens,
and the
la
ACRA
France étant en quelque
initiative
sorte
to
la
see
nation cadre au
how
sens militaire
we can
de cette
support
intervention. Soutien en
these
termes
forces
d'équipement,
in
de
Africa,
formation, de
and France will
coopération,
be acting as a framework
et
country
soutien
in
également
terms
par des
of
forces
defining the
spéciales dans la lutte contre le
cooperation
terrorisme.
and also
C'est comme ça
special
que nous allons
forces to
réarranger
fight
les
against terrorism.
Donc,
This
il
is
y a
how
un
we will be
esprit, il y a une continuité
reorganizing. So
complète
there's a
entre l'évolution de Barkhane
continuity
vers Takuba.
since
C'est
Barkhane,
exactement l'esprit de
Takuba,
Takuba que nous gardons.
and it is the
Il y a un
spirit of
changement de
Takuba
logiciel
that
que
will
nous avons
remain.
amorcé il y a à peu près 2 ans.
Something we
qui est de
began
dire on
about
est
2 years ago was that
beaucoup moins sur des bases
we decided
installées,
that we would
beaucoup
be
plus en
working
coopération
less
étroite
on
et en soutien
installed
des armées
military bases,
africaines.
but working closely to support
L'inflexion qui est portée par nos
African
décisions
armies.
ces derniers jours,
And
c'est que
in the past few
le cœur,
days,
si je puis
we
dire, de
have
cette
also
action ne sera
decided
plus au
that the
Mali,
heart of the action will
mais
no
sera
longer be in
au
Mali,
Niger, toujours dans la
but will
zone des
be
3
in
frontières,
Niger, in the area
et
of the 3
je dirais de
borders.
manière peut-être plus équilibrée, répartie
Perhaps
entre
it
tous les
will
pays
be
de la
more
région qu'ils souhaiteront.
balanced, spread out throughout different countries of the region.
Alors nous repartons à Bruxelles dans ce cas.
Back to Brussels.
Et nous prenons une question de Wael Mahaninou, journaliste multimédia marocain.
Question from a Moroccan journalist, Wael Mahimoud.
Vous pouvez y aller.
Bonjour Monsieur le Président.
Hello, Mr. President.
Je suis journaliste de la newsroom arabophone de CFI.
I am a
Ma
journalist from the
question
newsroom at
sera
CFI.
quel impact aura
And
l'instabilité
I'd like to
régionale
know what
de la
will be
région
the
du Sahel sur les
impact
investissements européens en Afrique?
on
Et
the
est-ce que
stability
la
of the Sahel
coopération
region,
européenne avec les pays du
and
Maghreb
will
jouera un
European
rôle
cooperation
rétablissement de la
with
paix dans le
the
Sahel?
northern African states be playing a role in stabilization of the Sahel region? Well, perhaps the President of the EU Council could give you more details about that.
D'abord,
First of
nous
all,
pouvons vaincre le terrorisme
we
de manière
cannot
durable
overcome
si
terrorism
précisément
sustainably
nous avons
unless
une action qui est beaucoup plus large
we
que
have a
le
much
simple
broader
sécuritaire.
action than
C'est le cœur de
just
ce que nous
security.
avons
That is
décidé
what's at the
à
heart of
Pau
what we decided
et
in
à N'Djamena,
Po and at
avec après un
N'Djamena.
sursaut militaire, ce qu'on avait appelé le sursaut civil.
We
Et
talked
donc, on
about
réussit
civil
à gagner
engagement.
durablement contre le
And so
terrorisme
we can
en faisant revenir
sustainably
l'État et ses
win
services
against
dans les zones qu'on
terrorism when we
et en
bring
faisant
in the
revenir
state and state
l'éducation
services, public services,
et en faisant revenir
education,
les projets économiques qui
and
permettent à la
economic
jeunesse
projects
de
that will
trouver
enable
justement
young
des débouchés.
people to
Sans
find a
quoi,
way forward.
très rapidement, quand vous libérez une
Otherwise,
zone
you can
des groupes
free up a
terroristes,
zone from
eh bien,
terrorist
si la
control,
population
and
est
if the
laissée dans le non-droit,
population
si la population n'est pas-
doesn't have
n'a pas de service
a
public,
rule of law,
si les
doesn't
enfants
have
sont
public
plus éduqués, s'il
services,
n'y a
if
pas
the
de
children aren't going to
solution
school, if there are no
d'avenir,
economic
les terroristes
prospects,
deviennent
the
en quelque sorte des
terrorists
promesses d'avenir.
become a
message de
promise
mort,
for
mais
the future. It's a
il
deathly
séduit sur
future, but
Et donc,
they
nous
are
avons
able
besoin
to
de multiplier les coopérations
convince
pour justement
people.
gagner cette
So
bataille. Et plus
our
largement,
cooperative
pour
efforts
aider
are to
l'Afrique à
win
réussir,
this
car
effort
c'est un
to
continent où
enable
la jeunesse est un
Africa
trésor.
to
C'est pour
win
ça
this
que,
battle
dans la
because
région du
Africa
Sahel, dès
and
2017,
its
nous avons
youth
bâti
are
cette
the
alliance
promise
pour
of
le
the
Sahel,
future.
dont je
And that
rappelais
is why we
les
have
chiffres
this
tout à l'heure.
Sahel Alliance. I talked about some of the figures earlier. Our vocation is to build projects on the ground to undertake investments that will create jobs. The Great Green Wall is also an initiative to create ecological and forestry opportunities. So yes, France has increased its investment in Sahel and in Western Africa. We will continue. We will continue to increase our investment, and the summit that will be held tomorrow with the African Union and the European Union will give a new frame to this alliance between Africa and Europe, with many projects with regard to health and education, but also investment and economic development. In this context, the states of Northern Africa have an essential role to play to ensure the stability, to help support the stability of the Sahel, but they also have a role because any instability in the Gulf of Guinea or in the Sahel will, of course, have an impact on the North African states, which are transit countries for migration. So, clearly, we will need the support of Northern Africa. I think when we talk about Africans and Europeans, we've been preparing this meeting in Brussels for many months, and we have seen that there is a great interaction between development, investment, prosperity, and stability and security. And the principle, the essential principle of this summit which we will be discussing, is how can we create operational projects on the ground that can channel public means so that every cent paid is invested effectively to encourage stability and development, and also to mobilize private investment. That's very important too, with some essential priorities that we must identify together. Of course, we want to take into account everything that has to do with decisions made by African states, that is, that African states identify their own strategies to attract more investment, to improve infrastructure, and mobilize all of the advantages that the continent has, so that we can work on development, investment, shoring up the private sector, encouraging small and medium industries, and all of this in a stable and secure framework. This will help us to carry out the transition that we all hope to achieve. Yes, just a word on this, the relationship between investment and security. The problem of security and the fight against terrorism in Africa goes beyond the Sahel. It is all of Africa today that is concerned. And the response must be a global one. In particular, the UN Security Council is there to help us fight against insecurity, to promote peace everywhere around the world. With regard to Africa, today we are trying with the Europeans to build a joint strategy, but beyond Europe, everyone must engage, because the fight against terrorism elsewhere in the world required global coalitions. It's not only an African issue or the issue of a few European countries. We need a broader coalition. We need to promote development on the African continent, and this is indeed one of the reasons why we're holding this summit in Brussels this afternoon. I think that Africans themselves are seriously committed. The President of Ghana said as much. And of course, we really appreciate the support of Europe and France in particular in this struggle. But this struggle goes beyond Europe. The United Nations must assume the responsibilities, and the Security Council must assume the responsibility of financing operations to build peace, maintain peace, to restore peace, and to fight against terrorism. This is what we would hope for from the international community.
Just a few words to what the chair of the African Union, the Senegalese president, has just said. I think anybody who has followed events in West Africa recently, in the last 10 years, recognizes the direct link between instability in Libya and its consequences for West Africa. I think it's no longer a mystery where these fighters came from and where the arms and finances came from for the struggle in West Africa. So the link between stability in West Africa, stability in the Maghreb, is one which is necessary for the fight against terrorism. And in the wider context, with all of these outrages taking place in various parts of Africa, is this the time for the Security Council, taking on the thought that has just been thrown out by President Macky Sall, is it the time for the Security Council to commit itself to winding down peacekeeping operations in Africa? I would have thought that this is the time where the Security Council would rather increase its presence in the search for peace on our continent. And this is not the time. What are we going to be talking about? Saving pennies and being, well, the English expression, penny wise and pound foolish. That cannot be the position of the global community as far as terrorism and stability in Africa are concerned. And these linkages between what's going on in our place, what's going on in North Africa and the Maghreb, these are direct linkages that must concern all of us, and therefore underline the need for a large coalition of forces in the world that see the stability of West Africa, the stability of the African continent as an essential ingredient in world peace and security as well. My hope is that when these matters are being commentated upon in the European media, that perspective is always present.
Nous allons prendre une toute dernière question de Rina Bassiste.
One last question from Rina Bassiste from the Monitor. Good morning, President. You spoke about mercenaries in Africa twice, and is this something which would influence your decisions if there were to be a Russian success? How would that have an influence on your position concerning Ukraine? Thank you. I think I said quite clearly earlier on that what we're seeing in Mali is that there are mercenaries from a private company which is called Wagner. And I think their presence is exactly what we have just heard from our colleague and President Adou. In fact, they have been in Libya, they've been in Central African Republic, they have taken terrible action against the local populations. And they've now come to Mali in a very predatory manner. And the reason for this is that the Malian junta, after two coups d'etat, feel that these people are the best placed to protect themselves, protect their own power, not to protect the local populations. And so increasingly, these sorts of governments are going to be using insecurity that reigns in their countries to actually use these sort of powers. And it's not only Russian mercenaries, but there are others as well. There's some 800 mercenaries present in Mali right now, and the coalition has asked and acknowledges their presence. I think we've got to recognize the link between these operations and the presence of these mercenaries. Many of the weapons that have been found come from Libya and from Syria, where these mercenaries were before. Russia, as a state, has publicly stated that it was not in any way behind the presence of these mercenaries. There is absolutely no text that has been agreed upon. There's been no treaty which enables the use of these particular forces with a sovereign state. So it's not a relationship between a sovereign state and another sovereign state. So I think what's happening here should not really be confused with other geopolitical issues that are on the agenda right now, where Russia is a sovereign state and where it is taking on a role as a political force and a military force. What we are doing is in perfect coordination, and after having long discussions with our African colleagues and other partners, is linked to the fact that, first and foremost, the transition since the summer of 2020 has decided no longer to deal with the security of their own country. And in fact, as I said earlier on, our forces would then necessarily be continuously facing insecurity and issues about protecting themselves and local populations without getting any support from anywhere else. But also the local organizations, ECOWAS and others, have condemned these positions. So what position could we have where we could protect a country which is no longer respecting the rules of transition, no longer ruling in a coordinated or democratic way? And finally, the transition government in Mali has stated quite clearly that it doesn't want to work with the Europeans any longer. The Danish special forces were sent away. Our ambassador was also sent away. So you can see that our position is to fight terrorism and support sovereign states. If a state were to decide to work with private mercenaries and decides no longer to work with you, a sovereign state, well, then obviously we should no longer continue to stay on. I think it's perfectly clear. And what is clear is that with the discussions that we've had, Africans and Europeans, what we've done is reorganize ourselves so that we do not actually give up on the Guinea Gulf or the Sahel or the other countries. And as has been said, this area is the epicenter of all terrorism activities in the area. Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our press conference, and we will now move on to Brussels. Thank you very much.